All right, let's talk about part two. Now, part two here is generally a little longer. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it in half and we'll call it 2A and 2B or something like that. But you get the point. So, you'll know when I stop because I will actually stop. So, anyway, part 2A here, what we're going to focus in on is essentially gas exchange and specifically how the gases move. And when I say gases, I'm specifically talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we'll talk a little bit about the factors that affect that. And then 2B will focus on gas transport, specifically how is the body transporting both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the first thing we need to address here is what's called Dalton's law of partial pressures as it pertains to this current context. So in a mixture of gases, the total pressure equals the sum of the partial pressures exerted by each gas. Now, I don't remember if I talked about this in part one, but when we're talking about this, and let's say, let's use our own air in the environment as an example. We all know that when we go outside and we breathe in the air that's there, we're not just breathing in oxygen, there's carbon dioxide, there's the dominant gas in our atmosphere is actually nitrogen, and it's pretty high. It's in I think the mid to high 70% range, followed by oxygen in the 20s somewhere. And so literally when you're breathing air, you're breathing in all of the gases that are in that air. And so it's a mixture of gases. So the total pressure in the air is made up, according to this law, of all of the individual pressures of the gases in that mix. And so when we talk about the gases and gas exchange in our bodies, and we're focusing in on oxygen and carbon dioxide, we're going to use these terms, PO2, which stands for the partial pressure of oxygen, and PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And so we're literally talking about how much of those individual gases are in the mix that is in our blood. Because if we're breathing in air, okay, we're not, our body doesn't filter out and only take in oxygen. We're taking in everything else as well. And so again, we have to address PO2 and PCO2. Okay, so just keep that in mind because I'm going to use these terms quite a bit in 2A, 2B, and then part 3. So when we talk about gas exchange, we're really talking about two different types of what we call respiration, external and internal. And so the most important thing is, well, where are they actually occurring? Okay, so external respiration is occurring in the lungs, and internal respiration is occurring at the tissue level where our cells are. Because remember, cells make up tissues. Okay, and exchange. That's the thing that I really try and drive home whenever we do this. Uh, whenever you whenever you exchange gifts with somebody, you give somebody a gift and then you get one in return. That's the exchange. Okay. So when my wife and I exchange gifts, I give her something, she gives me something. Okay. That's the exchange. And so you have to keep that in mind because we're dealing with gas exchange. And so in the lungs, what's called external respiration, here's what happens. The lungs, so the alveoli specifically, give oxygen to the pulmonary capillaries. So simplified even more, the lungs give oxygen to the blood. And then the exchange is the blood, the pulmonary capillaries, gives CO2 to the alveoli. The blood gives CO2 to the lungs. That's the exchange. The lungs give oxygen to the blood, and in exchange, again, blood gives CO2 to the lungs. Because remember, the only way that we can get oxygen into the bloodstream is to inhale. The only way to eliminate CO2 from the body is to exhale. Okay, so that's external respiration or gas exchange in the lungs. Internal respiration is referring to gas exchange at the cellular level. So this blood here that gets oxygenated in the pulmonary capillaries goes to the left ventricle and gets pumped out to the entire body. Now, when that oxygenated blood makes its way to the tissues, okay, the exchange, internal respiration, the exchange occurring at that level is the blood gives oxygen to the cells, and in exchange, the cells give CO2 to the blood. Okay, so again, gas exchange at the cellular level, which is internal respiration, is the blood giving oxygen to the cells, and in exchange, in return, the cells give CO2 to the blood. And now the blood has the ability to transport that CO2 back up to the lungs, where we get gas exchange there in the form of external respiration, and we can eliminate that CO2. Okay, so that is gas exchange. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to talk just a little bit about a couple of different factors that affect gas exchange in external respiration, but I'm also going to tie it into internal respiration as well. So this first point here, the thickness and surface area of the respiratory membrane. Now, that obviously is going to be exclusively part of external respiration. So over here, we have a blown up view of what's called the respiratory membrane. Okay, here are all the individual alveoli, and here is a pulmonary capillary. So the respiratory membrane is a three-layered membrane. You have the wall of the alveoli, simple squamous epithelium here. On the other side, you have the wall of the capillary, which is also simple epithelial tissue. And then you have a basement membrane, a very thin layer of connective tissue that fuses the alveolar wall to the capillary itself. So alveolar wall, basement membrane, capillary wall. Okay, the respiratory membrane. And normally, in a healthy individual, O2 goes, with external respiration, remember, O2 goes from the lungs into the blood, and CO2, blood to the lungs. And again, in a healthy individual, this isn't a problem. It happens quite efficiently, and it just works quite well. But if anything compromises either the thickness of this membrane or the surface area collectively between all of the alveoli in both lungs, then that's going to affect external respiration here in the lungs. So let's just focus on thickness for a second. Excuse me. Now, I'm not thinking of any sort of pathological condition off the top of my head because I'm not a doctor. But let's just say if let's say fluid somehow backed up into the lungs and somehow increased the thickness of this membrane, whether it's fluid building up on the inside of the alveolar wall or somehow fluid getting in between this area here where that basement membrane is. If you think about it logically, if this membrane, which is already thin as it is, and it's really easy for gases to go back and forth, that membrane becomes thicker for any reason at all, gases are now going to have trouble going back and forth. It's going to be more difficult for them to go through a thicker membrane. Less efficient gas exchange in this context now means that it's going to be more difficult for us to breathe. Okay, now when it comes to the surface area, if you remember from your anatomy days, you have 2 lobes of the left lung and 3 lobes on the right, a superior, middle, and inferior. Let's just say for the sake of discussion in this context that let's say my house was on fire and I was running back and forth before the fire department got there to try and save various mementos. And I took in too much smoke or just the heat. And let's say that my right inferior lobe, that third lobe in my right lung, was completely trashed and destroyed. I went from having the surface area of 5 lobes to now only having the surface area of 4 lobes. Now, when you go from 5 to 4 like that, okay, now gas exchange overall is going to be less effective, less efficient when it comes to external respiration, because again, you just lost area for the gases to go back and forth. So again, if anything compromises the thickness or surface area of this respiratory membrane, that is going to affect, in a negative way, external respiration. Now, the next thing is partial pressure gradients. And I'm going to skip over to this slide here, and I'm going to increase its size a little bit here. Now, if you look, we're looking at some different areas like the inspired air, the air in the alveoli, and the blood gases in the blood leaving the lungs, which is going to be the blood pumped out by the left ventricle. And you're going to see some discrepancy in numbers, of course, like the air here with in the inspired air that we take in there's much more oxygen in it than there is in the air in the lungs. And that's because of when it mixes. Okay. Now, take a look at these numbers here. Okay. And these numbers here. All right. So these numbers here, PO2 of 104 and PCO2 of 40, are on the alveolar side. PO2 of 40 and PCO2 of 45 on the capillary side of that respiratory membrane. So let's focus on O2 for a second. So 104 on one side, 40 on the other. Okay. Now I mentioned this concept in part 1, but when we talked about pulmonary ventilation and air moving, air always and only moves from high pressure to low pressure. Gases in our blood and in the lungs they follow the exact same rule. So they move based on partial pressure gradients. They go from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. Always. That's not my opinion. That is just fact. You can't even dispute that. So if there's a PO2 of 104 in the alveoli and a PO2 of 40 in the in the pulmonary capillaries, that's a partial pressure gradient, 104 to 40. So that means that oxygen is going to go from where it's higher in concentration, PO2 of 104, to a PO2 of 40. That's why it goes from the lungs into the blood. Now, when you look at CO2, okay, with the PCO2 of 45 millimeters of mercury in the blood and a PCO2 of 40 in the lungs, that's why CO2 goes the direction it does. That's why it goes from the blood into the lungs. Now, if you look real closely, there's a big discrepancy with the numbers between oxygen and CO2. And the reason we have to have much higher numbers with oxygen is CO2 is much more, let me rephrase it. CO2 dissolves much more easily and readily in our blood than O2 does. And so we have to have higher concentrations of oxygen to create the pressure gradients that we need to drive the oxygen that we need in the directions it needs to go. Okay? So that's partial pressure gradients. Okay, and so again, the gases are going to move down their partial pressure gradients. And so that example that I gave you between these two here was external respiration. Now let me scroll down a little bit here and let's look at these numbers here to these numbers here. And this would explain gas movements with internal respiration. So we've got 140 in the blood entering our capillaries, and we've got 40 and 45 in the tissues. Okay, so on one side, on the other. So when this oxygenated blood starts moving through the capillaries, this is why oxygen goes from the blood into the tissues, because it's going from an area of 100 millimeters of mercury to 40 millimeters of mercury on the other side in the tissues. So again, that's why oxygen goes from blood to tissues. And then again, the exchange, internal respiration, with the PCO2 greater or at 45 in the tissues, that's why CO2 will then move from the tissues into the blood where the PCO2 is roughly 40. So again, my friends, oxygen and CO2 are going to move down partial pressure gradients. Okay? Always. If anything changes these partial pressure gradients, that's just going to increase the amount of the gas that goes in a specific direction. We can use an example. So let me just kind of get that back down to size there. Let's say that you're exercising. You're maybe taking a spin class or some form of vigorous exercise. And I don't have exact numbers. I'm just kind of making this up as I go. But let's say that, again, we're working hard. And if our body is consuming more oxygen, our muscles are working harder, and everything else. Let's just say that the PO2 in the blood entering the lungs is now 30 millimeters of mercury. So we've got 30 on the pulmonary capillary side and 104 still on the alveoli. 104 to 30 is a greater partial pressure gradient than 104 to 40, which is under normal resting conditions. So if you change the partial pressure gradients, if you increase them like that, then that means that more gas is going to move in that direction. And so in that specific example, because we're working hard, the body is going to move more oxygen from the alveoli into the blood because, again, it needs to meet the metabolic demands at that moment. Okay, now we're going to skip the ventilation perfusion coupling for now, and I'm going to skip down to this. We need to talk a little bit about red blood cells and hemoglobin, our old friend right here. Now, erythrocytes. This term, be familiar with that. It's the technical name, the actual name for a red blood cell, an RBC. Now, our red blood cells, like it says here on that first point, are pretty much dedicated to transport gas. Uh, Red blood cells have the capacity, have the capability to transport both oxygen and CO2. Now, hemoglobin here is what's actually in the red blood cells that's actually doing the transport. Now, hemoglobin, as it says here, binds reversibly with oxygen. What that means is that hemoglobin has the ability to bind to oxygen to load up with it and then also to give it away or unload. Okay, so that's what binding reversibly means. Now, don't worry about these numbers. Those aren't going to. I never put those on the test, and I just have them in there for reference. Now, in hemoglobin, okay, there are four globin protein chains. Okay, and on each of those globin protein chains, there is a heme pigment. At the core of that pigment, or it says here, each heme's central iron atom binds one oxygen molecule. So four globin proteins, each of which has a heme pigment. And at the central core of that heme pigment, there is an iron atom that has the capacity to bind with one oxygen atom, or sorry, molecule. And so what that tells us is that a single hemoglobin molecule has the oxygen carrying capacity of four oxygen molecules. Now, I mentioned before, excuse me, that hemoglobin can transport both oxygen and CO2. It's because the iron core of the heme pigment is what is actually going to bind with oxygen. The CO2 is actually going to bind with areas on the globin protein. Okay, so that's why it can transport both at the same time. All right, let's take a quick little look at hemoglobin here. And as you can see here, pretty ugly. Okay, remember chemistry is Satan. It's the dark arts. Now, here's the thing that I really want you to wrap your brain tissue around here. Okay, is that whether hemoglobin is trying to load up with oxygen by it binding to these iron cores of the heme pigments, or it's trying to unload oxygen and give it away, the structure, the three-dimensional structure of molecule, this actual physical molecule here, can change shape. It changes shape under specific conditions of the concentration of oxygen, really, and then makes it easier for the oxygen to load up, or it actually makes it easier for it to unload because of the shape change. And so in part 2b, whenever we start talking about what's called affinity and how hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen affects its saturation level, it's all about the shape change, you guys. It's all about the shape. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind, file that away for now. Okay, real quick, some terminology here. So we already mentioned this. Each hemoglobin molecule can transport up to four oxygen molecules. A single red blood cell, we're looking at roughly 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So that literally means that the oxygen carrying capacity for a single red blood cell is a billion with a B, oxygen molecules. So that is pretty dang cool, I think. And it kind of puts it in context, like if you're bleeding out, or if you are a first responder and somebody is bleeding out and you're trying to treat them, think about that. If they're bleeding out, you're losing millions of red blood cells that are not now carrying billions of oxygen molecules to our cells and tissues. So bleeding out is a pretty big deal. Okay. Now, as you know, blood typically has a color. All right. Now, whenever whenever the hemoglobin in the blood is fully saturated, okay, meaning that it's carrying all four, we call it oxyhemoglobin right here, oxyhemoglobin. And it has more of a bright red, a ruby red color. Now, whenever oxygen goes to the tissues, okay, and gives away, unloads oxygen, okay, whether it's unloading one or maybe two, okay, the point is when it's not fully saturated, we call it deoxyhemoglobin right here, or reduced hemoglobin. Let's put that one in purple. Okay, so we call it deoxyhemoglobin or reduced. And when it's not saturated, that's when it takes on more of a darker crimson color. So you can kind of have an idea of what structure anatomically was damaged just by the color of your blood upon cuts or lacerations. If it's more of a bright red, it's you probably nicked an artery of some sort. If it's more of a darker crimson, you've probably damaged a vein, perhaps a capillary. Now, like I said before, hemoglobin has the ability to transport carbon dioxide as well. Now, whenever whenever CO2 is bound to the globin protein chains and it's in the blood that is making its way back to the heart to get sent to the lungs, okay? Number one, it's deoxygenated. So it's deoxyhemoglobin at that point when it's on its way back to the heart. At the same time, this is kind of where your mind gets blown a little bit. It's also called carbaminohemoglobin because it's essentially hemoglobin that's transporting less oxygen, but it's also now transporting more CO2. So it's referring to hemoglobin literally at the same time because it's on its way back. It's in the blood that's on its way back to the heart. So don't let these terms confuse you. Okay, oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin are simply referring to the hemoglobin molecule, which by the way is abbreviated HB. These two terms here and here are simply referring to whether hemoglobin is saturated or not. This term here, again, simply is referring to hemoglobin that is transporting carbon dioxide in the blood that's on its way back to the heart. All right, now, one more slide here, and then we're going to wrap up or we'll shut down 2A. There's a term here called affinity. Affinity is a super important term in this context. It means binding strength, okay, or a strong attraction. And so one of the first things we're going to talk about in 2B are the factors that affect hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, because that's going to determine whether or not it gets saturated. So affinity, again, is a binding strength or an attraction. And generally speaking, when one oxygen molecule binds to hemoglobin, that starts to increase hemoglobin's attraction for oxygen, and more O2 will follow it. It's a process called cooperative binding. Cooperative binding. So when one oxygen molecule binds, more will follow. I always like to joke around and think that, when you're kids and your mom will say, well, if your friends did this, are you going to do it too? Like if your friends jumped off a cliff, or are you going to do it too? And it's like, you tell mom, oh no, mom, of course not. I'm going to, do what you tell me to do. But inside, it's like, well, yeah, most likely I'm probably going to do what my friends are going to do. Okay. So it's like when one goes, more are going to follow it. All right. So the last thing I want to mention here is going to be our transition into 2B. So if hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen, that means oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin. Oxygen is going to load up to hemoglobin. Okay? If hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is low, that means oxygen is going to unload, or another way to look at it is the hemoglobin is going to give it away. So again, if hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen, it's going to take it, oxygen is going to bind to it. If the affinity is low, hemoglobin is going to give the oxygen away. It's going to unload it to the tissues that need it the most. All right, so we're going to wrap up part 2A with that thought. If you have any questions, hit me up.